Going to be telling you something about Pico's philosophy and his method of trying to attain mystical union with God through the emulation of angels and the prime importance of the soul, the rational soul, in this endeavor. So here we go. There we have him, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, the Prince of Concord. Pico was the Count of Mirandola. But he was also the Prince of Concord because Concordia was a secondary feudal holding of the family. And as Pico saw it as his life work to kind of account for the basic concord that existed in all philosophical and all religious tradition, he saw this title as a sort of confirmation of the divinity of his enterprise. So also, as you can see, Pico did not live long. He most certainly died by poisoning. But he was very famous in the time because people saw him as a sort of intellectual prodigy, and he was also very adept at languages. He learned ancient Greek, he learned Hebrew, he learned a dialect of Hebrew, he also learned Arabic. So I chose this. This shows the youth of Pico, so this kind of serves to confirm the preternatural wisdom of him. You see him as a baby, he's already reading, so God knows what his bedside literature was. Mine was Where the Wild Things Are, but I guess his was not. So contemporaries of Pico, they were full of praise of him. So I have a few quotes for you to consider. His friend, Angelo Poliziano, he called Divine Pico, he called him Phoenix, light of all learning, and than whom no other mortal is more beautiful or more eminent in all branches of learning. Ficino, who we've just heard about, when Pico died, he says, "Our dear Pico left us on the same day that Charles VIII was entering Florence, and the tears of men of letters compensated for the joy of the people. Without the light brought by the King of France, Florence might perhaps have never seen a more somber day than that which extinguished Mirandola's light." Now, this kind of flattery was basic humanist practice, to be honest. When addressing one's colleague, you would normally take on a subservient role, really elevating the learning of someone else. So it's a sort of false modesty, to be honest. But anyway, Pico is most famous for the oration that he wrote in 1486. Now, this oration usually carries the extra title, the Oration on the Dignity of Man. But Pico never called it that. The thing is that the oration has normally been hailed as one of the defining texts of the Renaissance because it's supposed to celebrate notions of dignity and human freedom, and it inspired the progression of the human intellect towards superior reason and the discovery of the laws of nature. But this is a sort of misreading brought on by a long process in philosophy, which wanted to reframe its history in Kantian terms. So trying to stress the opposition between the passive reception of phenomenal nature and the noumenal freedom of the human mind to rise above this and eventually perceive the thing in itself, so nature as it really is. So Pico then sort of becomes an inevitable prefigurement of the scientific revolution and thinkers like Newton and Kepler. But in fact, this was not true. Pico himself was never concerned with trying to control nature. Yes, Pico was concerned with contemplating nature as a way to reach God. So the oration is the introductory speech to a grand public debate that Pico planned to give in Rome, in which he would discuss all teachings and all sects. He had drafted 900 theses for this occasion, and he had submitted them to Rome. But Pope Innocent VIII had got a papal commission to investigate all these theses, and this commission denounced 13 of these theses, and found 3 of them to be explicitly heretical. So Pico hastily wrote an apology, trying to defend his thesis against heresy, while at the same time defining the nature of faith in religion and the nature of opinion. For Pico, faith was grounded in scripture. This was absolute to religion. But opinion was what he says, this is what early church fathers, this is the interpretation of scripture. So, needless to say, Pope Innocent VIII was not pleased. So he denounced the entire work and put Pico under inquisitional observance. So Pico fled to Paris. Unfortunately, he was intercepted and jailed, but Lorenzo de' Medici saved him, and he got him to come to Florence, where he could safely live under his patronage, and he became, in fact, a neighbor of Ficino. So this episode really telling me reflects the historical context in which Pico lived and in which he drafted his philosophy, so to speak, because the authority of the church was unquestionable at the time, and also the authority of the Pope by extension, because the Pope was Christ's vicar on earth. So even though people knew that sometimes the papacy could also be corrupt, Innocent VIII had illegitimate children, and he frequently sold papal offices to the highest bidder. But still, if you could not respect the Pope, you respected the position of the Pope. So then we had the role of philosophy. At that time, philosophy was an educative and an intellectual discipline, and it concerned itself with trying to account for the existing harmony between the law of nature and the law and the divine law, and the possibility of applying this to the order of society. So philosophers believed that God's order revealed itself as much in nature as it did in Revelation. So metaphysics at that time was concerned itself with questions like the immortality of the soul, because people wanted to know, where can we get eternal truth from? Where do we derive morality from? These were questions that concerned philosophers at the time. And also at that time, the most important, the prime authority in matters of philosophy was Aristotle. And Aristotle, of course, has harmonized with Christianity by St. Thomas of Aquinas. So even though Platonism started to gain a lot of popularity at that time, it could not replace Aristotelianism as a dominant subject in the universities. So in a sense, it was Aristotelianism that also stimulated scientific approach to nature by kind of stimulating a deducting of effects from causes. Then we have the role of magic. In that time, magic was real. There was no concern of mass hallucination or mumbo-jumbo as it is today, because church practices, liturgical practices like the Eucharist, these were magic. This was accepted magic. So the church often denounced things as demonic magic if it infringed on official practices of the church. So magicians always had to defend their use of magic, saying that it was natural magic and not demonic magic, because you were never allowed to call on evil spirits. Pico also does this. He defends his magic. He says, my magic only works by marrying earth to heaven. It's grounded in God's grace. Then we also have the political situation in that time. Italy was a hotbed of shifting alliances at that time. You saw the quote of Ficino, who told that Charles VIII of France entered Florence. Well, Charles VIII came to Italy because he wanted to claim the kingdom of Naples. And he had been prompted to do this by Pope Innocent VIII, because Pope Innocent VIII did not like Naples. The Duke of Milan also did not like Naples, so he said, come here. But as soon as Charles VIII had conquered Naples, there had been an anti-French league set up by Innocent VIII's successor, which was also joined by Milan. So you see, it was all internal strife and opportunism at that time. Also Florence, because Florence had the rule of the Medici at that time, but the Medici would be exiled, there would be riots, but the Medici would always be back. Pico lived also at that time. And one person instrumental in bringing about the exile of the Medici that Pico saw was Girolamo Savonarola, who was a preacher, a Dominican preacher, who became very popular because he argued against the moral laxity of the church and people who had political power. And Pico was very drawn to this. He became an ardent follower of Savonarola. He had brought Savonarola to Florence, and Pico gave away all his worldly possessions. He burned his poetry. Though I should add that the world of poetry did not suffer a tragic loss from this. And so Savonarola even delivered his eulogy. So this is also what Pico says in the oration, that he's trying to establish a sort of new spirituality, not built on strife and conflict. So here we come to his age. Pico wanted to establish a new approach to religion. He wanted to establish a purer and more original form of Christianity. Then, what I already mentioned, he wanted to account for the concord between all major traditions and Christianity. He wanted to sort of, Pico also believed in the Prisca Theologia, that there was this long chain of wisdom that had been passed on in centuries through all these great sages. But Pico also, this syncretic reading of culture. For Pico, it was all done from the view of Christianity. It was everything inevitably led to Christianity. Then Pico was this is what made Pico special in that time. He was one of the first Christians utilizing the Kabbalah. And for Pico, Kabbalah was of very large importance in the developing of spiritual insight. Kabbalah was a sort of second revelation for Pico, because it ratified Pico's belief in the prominence of scripture for faith. Because Kabbalah is an exegetical practice geared towards a reading of the Torah that does not discount anything. Everything in the Torah, even the smallest change in the letter, has meaning. So this obviously appealed to Pico. Ultimately, what Pico's aim was to attain mystical union with God. He wanted to reconcile man with man's divine origin. So let's take a look at Pico's cosmology, because this is important to understand. God is beyond every form of hierarchy. God is being itself. God is the act of existence, out of which everything else emanates. Everything else that there is participates in existence. God is existence itself. So then what we get? We get four worlds. We have the angelic or the intelligible realm. This is where all the angels live. They burn in a sort of perpetual fire of love for God. Then you get the celestial world of planets and stars. This world is not immortal, but it is immutable. Below that, there's the sublunary world of the plants and animals. Pico prefers to call these brutes. And then there's the fourth world, which incorporates all the elements found in the other, which is man, as the microcosm. Man is the bond and union of the others. And because man also possesses the unity of God, Pico says, God contains all things in his origin, but man contains all things in himself as their center. So what Pico also says is that man has a sort of special freedom. This is the freedom and a dignity that people have tried to read into the oration. Man has a dignity to move between these different kind of natures. We are not confined to one mode of existence. So what Pico is trying to establish is a sort of ontological supremacy of man. We have the power to adapt to different types of existence, to view existence from different viewpoints, actually. So then we come to Pico's division of human nature. Now, here he is seemingly a bit inconsistent. In the oration very early on, he divides man into having a vegetative soul, a sensitive soul, a rational soul, and an intellectual soul. Now, the vegetative soul, the sensitive soul, we share with the brutes. The intellectual soul we share with the angels. The rational soul is what is uniquely ours. This will become very important. Now, later on in Heptaprus, there's a more organized kind of ontology. So here we have the mortal body, the rational soul, the intervening spirit, which mediates between the rational soul and the mortal body. Then we have the intermediate sensual part, and then we have the angelic intellect. So even though this might seem inconsistent, there's a sort of inherent logic. What Pico distinguishes between is that he says that there's something that we share with plants and animals, with the brutes, which in this case is the vegetative soul and the sensitive soul, and here the intermediate sensual part. Then he says there's something we share with the beings that are higher than us, which is the intellectual soul, or the angelic intellect. So for Pico, there's always a sort of paradox in us. We can either be pulled down by our senses and by our basic desires, or we can be lifted up by our divine intellect, by our will to reach God. So what Pico is trying to say is that there's what defines us as man is the rational soul. Because the rational soul is the vehicle through which we can ascend to God. Because this ascent depends on knowledge and understanding. And this is what we get from the rational soul. So here we go to Pico's method to attain union with God. He says, what do we have to do? Well, simply put, we have to emulate the angels. Pico says, consider the angels. They are worthy of opinion. They are steadfast in judgment, and they burn with love for God. So, what should we do? Pico then mentions the dream that the patriarch Jacob had of the ladder to heaven, with angels going up and down the steps and eventually leading to God. So Pico says, if we want to be able to tread on this ladder, we have to be pure. So he proposes a 4-step program. First, what we have to do is we have to study moral philosophy. We have to study moral philosophy to kind of purge ourselves of moral impurities and remove our base desires and our sensual passions. Then the second part is dialectic. We have to understand dialectic to be able to distinguish between truth and deception, and truth, of course, being Christian truth. Then third, there's natural philosophy. We have to study nature. We have to contemplate nature, because through the contemplation of nature, we can get to know God. The final part is theology, which is the knowledge of divine things. If we study all these things, then we can properly ascend to God. Now, what does this come down to practically? This is where Pico's preeminence that he gives to the Kabbalah comes back in. Kabbalah reserves a very important role for numerology. In the Kabbalah, every letter of the Hebrew alphabet also has a numerical value. So there's all kinds of calculations you can do with names and words to attain holy numbers. Then, what also is important in Kabbalah is the meditation on the names of God. Because Hebrew letters are at the roots of the universe, Moses received a revelation directly from God, and he wrote it down in Hebrew. So Hebrew is sort of, it's the language of magic, because it's the voice of God. So, I have one sort of example here, which helps Kabbalists and obviously also Pico in a sort of meditation on God. This is a figure called the Tetractys. It's a Pythagorean cosmic symbol. It consists of a total of 10 points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, which sort of symbolizes the making of 4 into 10, which was very important for Pythagoreans. Now, for the Kabbalists, you can fill in these points with Hebrew letters. And one of the most important names is the Tetragrammaton, which is the sacred inutterable name of God. Now, if you put this into the Tetractys, you get here the name Yod He Vav He. So you get here the letter Yod. Yod has a numerical value of 10. So you get 4 times 10, which is 40. Then we get He, which has a value of, 5. So you get 3 times 5 is 15. Then you have Vav, 2 times, which has a value of 6. So you get here a value of 12. Then you have another 5, and this total adds up to 72. Now 72 is a number that was very important, because Kabbalists believed that 72 was the number of letters that the most holy name of God consisted of. If you could discover this name, you had discovered the key to the cosmos. So this is sort of a practical example which we can take from Pico. So what this all comes down to is that for Pico, Kabbalah was kind of a sort of true path toward union with God. And it's the rational soul that makes it possible, because it takes its inspiration from revelation and careful contemplation on the wonders of God. So, yes, like I said, rigorous study and exegetical practice. So, for Pico, it is the entire human soul, or the rational soul, posited at the center of creation and partaking every type of being that is daimonic. So, because the rational soul is capable of informing itself regarding the numinous destiny of mankind. But it also needs to first recognize this uniqueness. And this it does by a thorough understanding of Christian revelation and scripture. So, in a sense, Pico differs and agrees with traditional uses of the word daimon. Because on the one hand, his ritual practices of meditation are aimed at investigating celestial hierarchies. But on the other hand, he says these hierarchies and spirits are solely models for us to emulate. Because eventually we are higher than angels because of Jesus Christ. This is what Pico says. Jesus Christ was the full embodiment of God. So we have the power to go even beyond the angels and participate. No, not participate in being. We become being itself. So we ascend past the angels. And so, there we go. That was it. Yes. So, what I'm trying to say here, that is, for Pico, in the Renaissance, there was the boundary between physical and metaphysical was more porous than it was today. For Pico, even though he says that we should ascend to God by leaving the mortal body behind, this does not mean that he strictly renounces the material reality, because this is a sort of dualism that followed from Descartes, and this was not an issue for Pico, because people never thought of it in that way, because the material world reflected the spiritual world. It was a mirror of it, so there was no separation. So that even though Pico says that the soul should release itself from the body and ascend to God, become one with God, like any Christian, he would have also believed that at the end of time, the soul would be reunited with the body. So there's no question of dualism here. So, and furthermore, what is important is that for Pico, everything worked to justify his belief in Christianity. So, Pico della Mirandola, pious Christian at your service. That's it.